Hey, TEDxPlano fans. I have with me today Kim O'Neill, and she was a speaker, man, 2016. Kim, I went back and looked at the speech, and um, your speech back then is so relevant. And fans, I'm actually a little sad that I didn't start our recording earlier because Kim and I have had the most robust, a few tears on both of our sides conversation about. I'll probably cry again, but it's okay to be vulnerable. The situation that we're in right now with COVID. So, Kim, let's circle back, and we're just going to have people join with the flow of what we were talking about. How this is just unprecedented because we're seeing cracks in our system at places where we never expected to see cracks. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, just to kind of recap for those that didn't see my TEDx talk, my background is in municipal government. And so, for the past 30 years, I've worked primarily as a government leader in some way. And 10 years ago, we were talking about that I transitioned out and started serving in the nonprofit capacity as an entrepreneur. And I'm also a political science professor. And for the past 10 years, I've not struggled with leaving government. I thought that my career was over in the way that I had been trained and how I served. And I thought my experiences were going to be better on the other side. And I still believe that. But this is the first time I'm struggling. Like I'm really, really struggling with not being in-house as we're watching our governments respond to the pandemic. And, business will never be the same. We will never go back to doing things the way that we did it before. But we're seeing cracks in education. We're seeing cracks in government. We're seeing cracks in corporations. We're seeing cracks in the things that we assumed would always work that are not working anymore. We are, when things happen on large scales, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, we kind of, depending upon whether or not we were directly impacted, we will look at an area and go, oh my gosh, that's devastating, but we're okay on this side. And now we're looking at something where the devastation is worldwide. And none of us can really say it's not in my backyard. It is in all of our backyards. And so, how do we ensure that, number one, I think the one thing as my government mind is how do we ensure that the general health and welfare, right? That's our constitutional right. How do we ensure that the general health and welfare of our country is okay? While other countries are dealing with the exact same thing. But the reality is, we've expected certain people to show up. We expect people to have certain experiences, and we have, in our lifetime, we have not experienced anything like that. And so these cracks that we're seeing, for many people, they're devastating because they don't have another way. And financially, I think it was Kirk Franklin I saw on social media this morning that had given some testimony on an experience he had last night. But the reality is, um, many people now realize that they are just one paycheck or one expense away from homelessness, not having any funds, not having access to funds, don't know when the next pot of money is going to come in. I don't care if you're getting a supplement from one place to the other because you can't get to the banks. The banks, for some of them, are by appointment only. Like the things we just thought were normal are no longer normal for us. And there are cracks in everything that we now touch. I don't know anything, not grocery stores, not shopping on any type of online service that would be there that day or later. Nothing is working the way that we have become accustomed to. And it's hurtful and it's sad. And I think I was sharing with you before we started recording that I had read an article with the Harvard Business Review, and the title was "What You're Experiencing," or something. What you're experiencing is grief, and that we're all grieving in some capacity, and it's important that we recognize that we are.
So, Kim, you were talking about how those social fabrics, that structure isn't what we thought it was. And I wrote to myself, you hear the phrase, we're in this together.
Mhm.
I mean, that's kind of the catchphrase right now. Every season has a catchphrase, and that's the one. So that leans into the idea of collaboration. And I was thinking back to that 2016 speech of your voice is your currency. For as much as you were talking about individual responsibility, we have a responsibility to show up, to speak up. There was also a sense that it only works if everybody shows up. So, you have to collaborate and be willing to work together. Can you talk about, when you were saying things are never the same, what role does collaboration play in that, or can it play in that?
I think the greatest example that immediately comes to mind for me on what collaboration looks like right now, and a great example, because collaboration has had all kinds of definitions, and sometimes it's messy. But I think about North Texas Cares and the way that philanthropists and funders got together and recognized that the nonprofit community was hurting. And now it's up to 18 funders, I believe, 18 funders that got together and said the nonprofits need money and we've got to find a true way to distribute the money. But we're going to put one common grant application out. So nonprofits only have to fill out one application to tap into the potential of 18 different sources. And for them to recognize that, yes, we have the ability to either give if it's a wealthy funder, or to raise funds if it's a foundation, to distribute that money to people that are still boots on the ground trying to figure out how to serve, because business has not stopped for them, it just looks different. Those are the things that are important right now. And collaboration is hard when we don't recognize or that we want to work in silos, right? It's one industry against another industry, or one industry is more important than another industry, or even within the nonprofit community that I serve, that larger organizations are more important than smaller organizations. And I was watching a webinar last week with Dr. Francois Booker Drew, who is one of the VPs for State Fair of Texas. And she said it's the smaller nonprofits that are in the communities still working, and no one knows who they are and what they're doing. And she said through her conversations with them, she said she also recognized they're actually the ones with the data. They know because they're in the community. And I think this is a time for us to recognize that big doesn't always mean better. Small still has value. And at some point, there has to be some level of intersection across sectors to ensure that all sectors are taken care of, because we all have a piece in this puzzle, and it's not going to work when we work in silos at all. I'd also like to see like people like me who do have a background in skill sets and areas that could potentially still be beneficial, even though we're on the outside. I look at, I'm a native New Yorker, and I look at what's happening in New York right now. And I remember seeing, I pay attention, I remember seeing the stories of, we're down to the wire with medical professionals. So at this particular point, the state lifted some of the regulations to allow retired professionals to come back in. I know I've seen, now they're asking for veterinarians to also come in to help with people as well, with humans. And so now is the time to say the things that we thought we couldn't, the lines that we couldn't cross before, can we really cross them? And if it works now in the time of a pandemic, could it potentially work long term? And business as usual will never be the same. And we have to look at better ways to do it for the benefit of all of us. And you can't leave anyone behind at this point. Everybody has some level of value. And there's so many lessons to learn from all pockets of our communities, and from our leaders. You know, they're leading. I don't care whether or not people think they're leading well or not, but our leaders are on the front line. Our essential personnel are on the front line. The people that we thought were considered essential personnel are a piece of that puzzle. And before we started talking, we were talking about the service industry, and just the devastation. I have a student, and we were talking, and he was just sharing that he lost his job, because he works in the service industry. And so, how can I expect him to successfully complete this semester when right now he's thinking about income and a child on the way? And so, we have to figure out how to help people. I think the other thing in our community that has been working well in terms of collaboration, and I may get the name wrong, and folks may need to look it up, but I think it's Get Shift Done,
Shift work.
Shift work. And the thought that the nonprofit community has a resource that was quickly put together that allows them to hire, instead of pulling in volunteers, hire people that have been displaced in the service and hospitality industry to actually allow them to still collect some level of income, to me just shows that we are better together. And in times of chaos, innovation works and wins. And I'm worried. I'm to be quite honest, I'm worried.
What are you worried about?
Number one, the economy, without a doubt. I'm worried about, can we see ourselves pull back, even if and when we get to a point where we're living some level of a normal life again. How will we all respond to going out and engaging in that human interaction that we all need? And I think that we're all really still looking for. I'm worried about those who are economically disenfranchised pre the pandemic and what's happening in their lives. I'm worried about our K through 12. Anybody that knows me knows education policy is a big deal for me, and I don't have children. But what's happening with K through 12 now? We worry about children losing a half a reading grade level over the summer. And now we've transitioned them to learning online, whether or not they had the resources. We don't know what home looks like for them. And so where some students are able to work in a quiet area, some students may not be able to. And so I'm worried about those who live in harmful home environments and how they are dealing now that we're all told to stay home. Where do they go for relief? I'm worried about people eating. Before it was, people that went to food pantries, it's because economically they just couldn't afford to. And so there's that stigma. But now people are going to food pantries in droves and food banks because they have to get it. But I'm worried about the people that are serving us when we need, the people that are still on the front lines serving us and ensuring that they too are protected. My brother works in the airline industry. And, he reached out and said, have you all ever been through anything like this before? Potential layoffs, furloughs, and then access to PPE. And he said, well, 3 people on his team had been recently diagnosed, and they're not provided the opportunity for social distancing when they're working. And so here we have someone who works in the industry, and there are many like him across the country that are still serving without access to PPE. And so it just makes me think the people that can't afford to, who may not be essential but can't afford to not work, but their jobs are still open, we're requiring them to do something the rest of the country they're not doing, because we've been told that we shouldn't do it. And so there's just a lot of worries. And I think that's the former city manager in me, just thinking about people
Mm-hmm.
and what that looks like for community, what that looks like for our elderly. I think the two things that probably grip me the hardest, people who are passing away in hospitals alone because their families can't come see them, and then not being able to honor people that have passed away because of the restrictions for gatherings for funerals. We were talking before. I mean, if they've passed away, that's one thing, but the thing that brings us together and provides some level of peace and calm is the fact that we're able to get together. And we're not able to do that because many places, no more than 10 people can be in a funeral home at the time, including the staff. And so life is just different right now. And to sit in a house all day,
It's hard.
it's hard. It's very, very hard. And that can be mentally draining for some people. Introverts like me might be okay. But people who thrive on human connection, this is hard for all of us. And so I never stop worrying. I'm a New Yorker, so I mentioned before we started, to not know someone who has passed away at this point is not normal, especially within the city. And I have a friend who lost 4 friends within a 1 week period. Um, 2 were in the same location. I think it was the end of February, the first week of March, and then 2 additional passed a week later, unrelated spaces. And you just think of what that has to feel like, not just for them as someone who's suffering, but also for their family members and their friends. One of the funerals was by conference call. And this is one of the men, he's well known in the city. And to think that his funeral was via a conference call, it's devastating. And it's not settling. And I just hope we get to the point. I know we will eventually, but I just hope we can get to the point where we're coming out healthy, and not just healthy meaning physically, I mean mentally healthy. Because this is a lot.
It's not normal. You're right. And I was going to ask you to put your city manager hat back on. So you're right. I mean, I know some of the fans might not know I work for a city outside of what I do with TEDxPlano, but I know our city manager has definitely the worries and carries the worries. But the challenge and the blessing of being in city management is balancing worry. You have to look for the opportunity. So if I'm worried about this, what's my next step? So if you were not necessarily Plano, but if you were putting that hat back on, what would you tell yourself and tell the community as like, this is what our path forward through worry could look like?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Last Sunday, I had I guess a happy hour meetup with one of my former teams when I worked in the Washington, D.C. area. And sitting with them, I still felt like their leader. You never give it up. But when you are a leader and you are charged with the welfare of people, what you do and how you respond is the indicator for how they're going to respond. And so it's a big burden to carry. It's a huge burden to carry. Like something as simple as snow removal for me, which felt like a nightmare. I would give anything if I were a city manager right now to just have people calling to complain that we didn't remove the snow good enough for them. But I do think it's important in this season, because we are talking about health, for us to be honest with community about just whatever the concerns are, and giving advice on what the community can do better. But leadership has to see 10 steps prior to what community even sees. By the time the community receives the information, we should already be on the next steps. There's no sleep right now. There's no rest right now. There's a lot of anxiety right now. From a leadership perspective, I just ask for people just to send good vibes towards leaders, whether or not you think they're doing a good job or not, because this is not easy and it's unprecedented. There's nothing in modern time for us to go by as best practices. As a city manager, I would probably be our first responders who are going into harm's way, serving, getting people would be probably one of my biggest concerns, not my own, but one of my biggest concerns, because we often look at them as superheroes and forget that they are human too and are susceptible to the exact same things that we are. As a city manager, I think one of the things that I think is beautiful about this time, if I can find beauty in any of it, is the fact that we do have emergency operation commands that are more common than they were when I was. So, to have an expert, if you're privileged and lucky enough to have an expert that should be the guide through all of this, even though, again, it's unprecedented because we don't have anything to go by in modern times, but to have someone whose skill set is about emergency, I think it's a huge asset. And I just encourage anyone, whether they're in a really small city or a large city, to allow for the leaders to allow that person to lead. Because we are all gifted in our own skill sets, and we all might feel like we know what's best for community, but that person has been trained to know what's best for community, even when it's uncomfortable. And so with that hat on, and I think that's where I'm struggling, that the things that I know that I can provide, I don't have a mechanism to do it. And once a government professional, always a government professional. Once you love what you've done and you know the impact that it can make, you want to make sure that that kind of service and support is given. And so if I can leave anything with the viewers, whether or not you think government on any level is doing a great job, that's a different conversation. Just know that the people that are supporting our leaders and trying to get the information out and trying to figure out what this is, they're struggling too. And they still have families and they still have concerns and worries about their own safety as well. But as leaders in government, we don't have the privilege of putting that to the side. The job still has to get done. And what we hope is that the job gets done well. And then after this, we will find a way to look at the total lessons learned and put together some really great guides for government and for leaders to use across the country. Because we assume that everybody is on the same level, but they're not. Big government is very different than small government. Rural government is very different than suburban and urban government. State government is very different than national. National is different than everything else. And when we have this melting pot of ideas going at the same time, it can be overwhelming for community to kind of figure it out. But I think it's also important that community understands, digest what you can. Stay safe and digest what you can. And when it becomes overwhelming, walk away, because I guarantee the information is going to be repeated again. And identify, if I was a city manager, the one thing that I would kind of enforce and try to make sure people would adhere to, and I can't do it, but I would try my best, identify reliable sources and make that your point. Don't overwhelm yourself trying to keep up with all sorts of social media with everyone sharing something very different. Identify what's most reliable, maybe one or two sources that you can get what you need, and then walk away. Because if not, what we start to see is more paranoia than what we need. We see more people going with misinformation than the information they actually need. And don't think because it may not be in your community today that it cannot be in your community tomorrow, or actually that it's already there and you don't know. And so err on the side of caution, so that we can hopefully just get out of this sooner than later. I think that's like the biggest takeaway, that I hope that our leaders are sharing. But again, somewhere along the way, we have to remember they too are in harm's way and trying to make the best decisions for us. And we have to trust that collectively some great decisions are going to be made, but there are going to be bumps and bruises along the way, because there's nothing to provide us with a guide. There's nothing.
That is very true. That is very true. I think maybe for our last question, I do want to talk about what you're doing right now, because I think it's a good word and a good kind of point of hope. There was a reason you transitioned out of government, and the reason you're doing what you're doing today. And I think it's really beautiful work. And the phrase that you use is social innovation. And I love that. And I think, wow, what a great time. And you understand this, but I'll explain for the listeners, because I didn't understand it until this is my first fortunately, major crisis to go through in the government. In 5 years, that's pretty shocking, but we've avoided some major things. And what I've learned through the process of disaster declarations, Kim's like, yeah, I know, but it allows the rules to be reset.
Yeah.
So the things that we all get frustrated with about government, about process and red tape and things, that tape gets moved, and so all of a sudden there is opportunity for faster innovation, because you're using a different playbook for this time period. And I think it's relevant to what you're doing right now, because you basically for yourself reset the playbook. Yeah. So if you were talking to our viewers as kind of a final takeaway on, like, this is an opportunity in life where you're resetting your playbook, whether you chose to do it or not, it's happening and it's been given to you. What would you encourage people to do with social innovation?
I think that we all have to kind of open our minds right now to know that, again, business as usual, it's not going to be right now. And honestly, it's not going to be the same. There are many things that probably can go back, but business as usual will not be the same when it comes to education. And looking at just within the past month, how education across this country has had to change. What I would hope is that we start looking at, how do we teach K through 12 and higher ed moving forward? And what are the emergency plans that need to be in place? What's the emergency plan for your home? I remember growing up, my grandfather used to always say, keep $20 in your sun visor in your car. Keep cash in the house. And we're now realizing that here we are in a tech-driven world, and cash actually still matters depending upon where you are. I think when it comes to social innovation, the definition of social innovation that we kind of use across the sector, when you're doing something new and innovative that's not being done in the area in which you're serving. It doesn't matter if someone has already done it someplace else. This is the season for us to really look at how we can do things better. How do we move away from tradition that might be holding us back? I have been openly talking about that there needs to be, on the government level, that there needs to be a chief service officer in larger cities, mid to large size cities moving forward, that's responsible for bringing the nonprofit, the philanthropic, the private, and the government sector together, because our organizations really are standing in and filling in the gap, and we don't quite recognize it that way. I think that we also have to say and look at what roles do we all individually play. And going back to my TEDx talk, your voice is your currency. Like, that's the most valuable thing that you have. And when you have a voice that people listen to or recognize, how are you using it? And are you using it in a way that can benefit people, but are you afraid of using it to benefit people because it might have some level of negative connotation associated with you moving forward? And I think, innovatively, we've got to move past that, because there are so many people with so many amazing ideas, and so many people that I know that no one's ever listening to them. But if you sit down and talk to them, like, some of our solutions are already there. So now it's really about listening to people. And, sometimes people don't like to hear me say this, but listening to young people. They have the privilege of being raised as a digital native, and so they understand things a lot differently. And I think we have to find a way, as I would say, like Generation X and older, finding a way to take what we know to be right and then helping them to understand the whys behind that, but then also listening to them about what frustrates them. Because we think about what's happening right now, if we had more young people involved in the process, I'm not going to say everything would be right. That's, I think that would just be a fantasy world, but I do think that we would be able to move a little differently. I think about the 17-year-old, I think he's from the state of Washington, that started tracking coronavirus cases, and then just went on YouTube and figured out how to code and build a website that pulls data in from government sources around this country just to track the number of cases. Like, there's so much that can be done, but we can't be afraid of what those results might be. And so innovatively, just thinking about how can you be of support? How can we all get more involved? I will always say, how do we all get more involved in government? How do we all get more involved in the nonprofit sector beyond just donations? I think I'm happy to see all of the relief funds, the larger relief funds that are coming up across the country. But if you love an organization, donate directly to them. They need the cash immediately before applying for the grant. And so just looking at and saying, what can I do to make a difference with that? And is there someone else that is doing something better that I can pay attention to and find a way to bring it in-house or in my community? I look at Collin County and the number of residents that just popped up with ideas to help one person, and they've turned into initiatives, within their communities, and they're doing them as safely as they can. But they recognize that there are some of the most vulnerable people in the community that need help, whether it's that they're elderly, sick, pre-existing health conditions with a number of children, can't get outside, don't have cars. And it really is about leaving no one person behind. And at this time, it is about innovation. It is about doing things differently. It is about saying, if this is the worst that we've ever felt, how do we make sure we don't feel this way again? Should this happen again? Because now that we know it's happened, the possibility of it happening again in our lifetime, I hope it doesn't. The possibility is there. And now we know we have to stand up and respond a lot differently. So what do we do on all levels, government, government, social sector, corporate America, and then community? What do we do differently, and how do we work collaboratively to ensure that we can be better the next time around?
That's a great word. Well, TEDxPlano, we're going to end our conversation here, although I might stay on the phone a little longer. I love talking to Kim. Kim challenges me and encourages me, and I hope she's done the same for you. I think for me, the biggest takeaway, two things. I still am very inspired by your voice as your currency. The second half of that, though, that I clearly heard was that voice accompanies doing. So do something. And right now, doing something might look like sharing cash, to meet immediate needs until it's safe to get out. But being loud and just writing a check isn't enough. It's about doing and being part of thinking through. So thank you, Kim, for that. Thank you, fans, for tuning in today, and we hope this conversation has challenged you as you're sitting at home or wherever your safe place is figure out now how you can make a difference, and don't let this reset time that we've all unwillingly gone through together be for naught. You know, this is a golden opportunity for the next thing. So until the next conversation, thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Shannah.
All right, and thank you, TEDxPlano. We'll talk to you again soon.